It was at precisely 3:30 that afternoon, when Whimsy, having settled himself with the air of a man preparing for a lengthy siege, began his inquiries into the matter of the household's temporal arrangements, a subject which seemed to generate in his interlocutors that particular expression of baffled irritation which the English reserve for those who concern themselves with matters of observable fact rather than convenient assumption. He had requested the presence of the entire household in the drawing-room, a demand which Inspector Craigie had received with the stoicism of one accustomed to Whimsy's methods and their occasional fruition in unexpected directions. The assembled company presented itself with that reluctant uniformity of the bereaved English middle class. Mrs. Dorothy Mallory, a woman of some 55 years, whose widow's weeds appeared to have been donned with the enthusiasm of one assuming a costume for a theatrical production. Young Mr. Marchmont, whose fingers betrayed a slight tremor as he lit his cigarette, and whose eyes possessed that quality of calculating anxiety which speaks volumes about a man's financial circumstances. Miss Thorne, the housekeeper, whose stiffened posture suggested she conceived the proceedings as a personal affront to her professional competence. Prothero the valet, whose expression of studied indifference masked what Whimsy suspected was considerable nervous tension. And finally, a cook named Mrs. Finch and a housemaid named Dorothy Clemens, both of whom possessed that air of defensive solidarity which servants adopt when confronted with the machinery of official inquiry. Whimsy began, as was his custom, with the most pedestrian of observations, inquiring with genuine interest into the precise moment at which various clocks throughout the house had last been wound. A question which produced from Miss Thorne the information that the grandfather clock in the hall was wound every Thursday morning without fail, a practice established by Mr. Mallory himself some 15 years previous, and that the mantelpiece clock in the study, a rather handsome French piece of no particular value, had been wound by Mr. Mallory on Friday evening, as was his invariable habit. The drawing-room clock, according to Mrs. Mallory, had stopped some 3 weeks previous, and she had not troubled to have it repaired, as she found the silence rather more agreeable than the perpetual ticking, which had, in her estimation, contributed substantially to her late husband's nervous disposition, a remark which caused her to amend hastily to my late brother-in-law, though the slip appeared to have gone unnoticed by all save Whimsy, who filed it away with the manner of one collecting buttons for a coat that would not be assembled for some considerable time. Upon further inquiry, pursued with that relentless courtesy which characterized his method, Whimsy ascertained that the study clock had been observed by Mrs. Mallory at 8 o'clock that morning when she had passed the study door while taking her constitutional walk about the garden, at which time it had indicated the hour with admirable precision, that Prothero had noted the time at approximately 9:15 when he had gone downstairs to fetch Mr. Mallory's breakfast tray, and that the study clock, when discovered by the police upon their arrival, had ceased to function at a time which the police surgeon estimated to be somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, though he had expressed conviction, which suggests a man speaking from professional obligation rather than genuine certainty. Whimsy had then turned his attention to the matter of the study's illumination, a subject which seemed to puzzle Inspector Craigie considerably, as illumination appeared to bear no relationship whatsoever to the manner or timing of Mr. Mallory's death. Yet Whimsy pursued the matter with admirable persistence, ascertaining that the study possessed both gas and electric light, the gas jets having been installed when the house was built in 1887 and never removed, while the electric installation had been added some 12 years previous by a firm from Guildford, whose competence young Mr. Marchmont vouched for with suspicious enthusiasm. The curtains, Whimsy noted, were of a heavy damask material which had been hung, according to Miss Thorne's testimony, approximately 5 years previous, and which effectively obscured the study windows when drawn, a circumstance which appeared to have been achieved on the morning in question, judging by the position of the fabric when the body had been discovered. It was at this juncture that Whimsy had inquired, with an air of pure academic interest, whether anyone had observed the smell of turpentine in the vicinity of the study at any time during the previous evening or morning, a question which produced a moment of considerable silence, during which young Mr. Marchmont's cigarette came dangerously near to singeing his upper lip, and Miss Thorne's already rigid posture appeared to achieve an almost geometric quality of tension. It was Prothero who finally responded, with the air of one reluctant to volunteer information, that he had indeed noticed a faint odor of turpentine when he had passed the study door on his way downstairs on Saturday evening, having supposed that Mr. Mallory had perhaps been cleaning a painting or attending to some matter relating to the house's maintenance, though he had thought nothing of it at the time, and had not considered it relevant to mention to the police. Whimsy had received this information with every appearance of delight, as though Prothero had just confirmed the existence of a previously theoretical principle, and had then turned his attention to the matter of the Turkish carpet, a subject upon which he had displayed what appeared to be a quite disproportionate expertise, discussing with great particularity the methods by which such carpets were customarily cleaned, the particular solvents employed for the removal of various stains, and the distinctive appearance of recently cleaned wool when compared to aged fabric. It was only as the afternoon light began to fail, and the shadows in the drawing-room grew increasingly pronounced, that Whimsy had excused himself, remarking with apparent casualness that he believed he had observed something of interest in the study's fireplace, and that he would need to examine it. With greater care in the fading light, a statement which had caused Inspector Craigie to follow him with the determined expression of a man who has long ago learned that Whimsy's seemingly idle observations frequently preceded the emergence of unexpected and troublesome facts. The study, when they entered it some few minutes later, possessed that particular quality of dusty gloom which descends upon rooms that have recently harbored death, a combination of stale air, the lingering chemical smell of the police surgeon's examination, and that indefinable atmospheric quality which seems to attach itself to spaces where violence has occurred. Whimsy moved directly to the fireplace with the purposefulness of a man who has previously formed a precise hypothesis and is now engaged in its confirmation, kneeling beside the marble surround with a grace that belied the elegance of his tailoring, and directing Inspector Craigie's attention to a series of minute marks upon the interior of the firebox, slight scorings upon the blackened metal, as though something had been placed there with considerable care and subsequently removed with rather less attention to gentleness. Upon closer examination, these marks suggested the presence of what Whimsy identified as a wire frame of some sort, the kind commonly employed in the support of small domestic objects, though he refrained from specifying the exact nature of the apparatus until he had subjected the hearth itself to an equally minute examination. It was here, in the ash-choked depths of the fireplace, that he discovered the first truly incriminating fragment, a small piece of colored glass, no larger than a thumbnail, of a distinctly greenish hue, and possessing the particular quality of thickness which suggested it had originated from a piece of laboratory equipment rather than decorative tableware. Inspector Craigie, upon being shown this specimen, had assumed the expression of a man who has just been presented with evidence of considerable significance, and yet possesses no theoretical framework within which to comprehend its meaning, a circumstance which Whimsy appeared to find enormously entertaining, though he merely remarked that he suspected the police might wish to preserve the item for later chemical analysis, and that he would venture to suggest that a search of the household's various cupboards and storage areas might prove illuminating with respect to the discovery of additional fragments or, indeed, of the original apparatus from which this piece had derived. It was at this moment that young Mr. Marchmont, who had followed them into the study with the air of one drawn by irresistible compulsion toward the scene of his prospective inheritance, had made what Whimsy would later identify as a critical error of judgment by inquiring, with a nervous laugh that suggested the tension beneath his carefully constructed nonchalance, what conceivable purpose a piece of laboratory equipment might serve in his uncle's study, thereby revealing that he possessed at minimum a theoretical understanding of the object's classification, if not its precise function. Whimsy had responded to this observation with a comment regarding the remarkable perceptiveness of the younger generation, and a casual inquiry into whether Mr. Marchmont possessed any knowledge of chemistry or the various experimental sciences, information which the young man had hastened to disavow with such vehemence as to suggest the opposite was substantially closer to the truth. The conversation had been interrupted by Miss Thorne's entry into the study, a transgression which she had apparently committed in a state of some emotional disturbance, as her customary composure had fractured sufficiently to permit the observation that there was a matter of considerable importance which she believed ought to be brought to the attention of the authorities immediately. A statement which had caused her to pause and modify her phrasing to the effect that she had neglected to mention, upon the occasion of her previous interrogation by the police, a certain incident which had occurred on the previous Friday evening. According to Miss Thorne's now faltering testimony, she had observed Mr. Cuthbert Mallory emerging from the study at approximately 7 o'clock on Friday evening in a state of what could only be described as considerable agitation, his clothing bearing traces of what she had supposed at the time to be dirt or dust, though in retrospect she recognized that the substance might have possessed a rather more suspicious character, and his expression having suggested to her experienced eye that he had undergone some form of emotional or physical exertion of a nature which had occasioned surprise. Furthermore, she had noted that the study door had been locked upon his exit, a circumstance which was itself somewhat unusual, as Mr. Mallory typically locked the study only in the evening prior to retiring, and his doing so at such an early hour had struck her as noteworthy, though she had not, she hastened to explain, considered it sufficiently remarkable to warrant mention to the constabulary. Whimsy had received this information with every appearance of satisfaction, remarking that the human capacity for selective memory was one of the more reliable constants in his experience of criminal investigation, and had then returned his attention to the fireplace, where he had begun to construct, with meticulous care and in full view of his assembled audience, a theoretical model of the apparatus which he suspected had recently occupied the position marked by the scorings upon the metalwork. Using a pencil as a substitute for whatever wireframe had previously existed, and drawing upon his considerable knowledge of mechanical engineering, he had outlined an arrangement whereby a glass vessel of some substantial size might have been suspended within the fireplace, positioned in such a manner as to receive heat from a controlled flame while remaining secure against accidental displacement. The purpose of such an arrangement, he had observed in that tone of detached academic interest which generally preceded his most unsettling revelations, would logically be the heating of some liquid substance to a temperature sufficient to produce vapor, a process which would necessitate either considerable stupidity or considerable determination on the part of an individual undertaking it within a locked room in broad daylight, as the resulting fumes would present a danger not merely to the intended victim, but to any individual unfortunate enough to be present at the moment of the apparatus's failure or catastrophic malfunction. Inspector Craigie, upon hearing this observation, had begun to formulate questions which Whimsy had forestalled with a raised hand and a request that they might postpone further discussion until the following morning, as he had formed a hypothesis which required confirmation through certain specific inquiries which he preferred to undertake without an audience, a statement which had left everyone in the room possessed of the unsettling conviction that Whimsy had identified the murderer, but declined to share this information until he had established the precise mechanism of their crime. The night which followed Whimsy's cryptic pronouncement was characterized by a quality of considerable unease throughout the Mallory household, a tension which manifested itself in the various residents' inability to maintain their customary routines and in the tendency of conversations to lapse into uncomfortable silence whenever Whimsy's name was mentioned, or his theories regarding the apparatus in the fireplace, were recalled. Whimsy himself had retired early to his guest quarters, a bedroom of respectable dimensions decorated in that particular style of aggressive floral wallpaper, which seemed to afflict Victorian country houses with the regularity of a chronic complaint, and had occupied himself with the perusal of certain technical volumes which Inspector Craigie had been persuaded to retrieve from the local lending library, treatises on the properties of volatile chemical compounds, and the methods by which various substances might be rendered into gaseous form through the application of controlled heat. It was only at approximately 11:30 in the evening that Whimsy had emerged from his room and made his way with deliberate quietness to the study, where he had spent the better part of 2 hours conducting an examination of Mr. Mallory's personal papers with the thoroughness of one searching for a needle in a haystack, yet possessed of an absolute certainty regarding the needle's general location. What he discovered in the lower drawer of Mr. Mallory's desk, concealed beneath a layer of seemingly innocuous correspondence, was a series of letters written in a feminine hand and addressed in terms of considerable tenderness to my dearest C, expressing sentiments of affection which left no doubt as to the intimate nature of the relationship they documented, though the letters themselves bore no date and no clear indication of the identity of their author beyond certain references to a modest cottage near the village and an arrangement of considerable financial benefit which the writer appeared to regard with a mixture of gratitude and something approaching emotional dependency. Whimsy had photographed these documents with the aid of a small camera which he carried for precisely such purposes, and had returned them to their place with such meticulous care as to leave no evidence of their disturbance. It was as he was completing this task that he had heard, from somewhere in the depths of the house, the sound of a door closing with deliberate quietness, the sort of sound which suggests an individual moving through familiar corridors in darkness, possessed of considerable motivation to avoid detection. Whimsy had extinguished the study lamp and positioned himself in the shadows beside the fireplace, from which vantage point he had observed, through the study's open doorway, the figure of Miss Thorne passing along the corridor in the direction of the kitchen, her figure rendered ghostly by the pale moonlight filtering through the landing window, and her gait suggesting a purpose of considerable urgency, masked by an attempt at casual movement. He had followed at a discreet distance, moving with the silence of one trained in the observation of others' movements, and had descended the kitchen stairs in time to observe Miss Thorne unlocking the pantry, a space which Whimsy had previously noted contained various cleaning materials and chemical supplies, and removing from the uppermost shelf a glass vessel of precisely the dimensions which would have fit the wire frame previously suspended in the study fireplace. The container had retained a faint residual odor of turpentine, which explained the olfactory evidence which Prothero had observed on Friday evening, though the vessel's true purpose appeared to relate not to paint thinning, but to something considerably more sinister in its implications. Miss Thorne had then replaced the vessel and had turned to depart, at which moment she had discovered Whimsy standing in the pantry doorway, with an expression of profound courtesy and an almost apologetic demeanor which suggested he regretted the necessity of having observed her nocturnal activities. The housekeeper's reaction had been immediate and entirely predictable. A moment of shock followed rapidly by an assumption of defensive hostility, accompanied by a blustered denial of any impropriety, and an assertion that her presence in the pantry at such an hour was merely occasioned by insomnia, and a desire to prepare some warm milk for consumption in her room. Whimsy had accepted this explanation with every appearance of belief, merely observing that he had himself suffered from occasional insomnia, and that he found the practice of consuming warm milk to be of questionable efficacy, though he acknowledged that certain individuals swore by the remedy. with considerable conviction. He had then invited her to return to her room, remarking that they might perhaps continue their conversation at a more convenient hour on the following morning, when the light was superior and when he might ask her certain questions regarding her knowledge of chemistry and her relationship to the late Mr. Mallory, a statement which had caused Miss Thorne's face to undergo a transformation of considerable rapidity, the defensive expression giving way to something approaching resignation, as though she had been maintaining a fiction which she was now relieved to abandon. It was only when she had mounted the kitchen stairs, moving with considerably less stealth than had characterized her descent, that Whimsy had permitted himself a satisfied expression, and had returned to the study to complete his examination of the papers with a now sharpened sense of what connections might exist between the correspondence concealed in Mr. Mallory's desk and the presence of a chemical apparatus within the fireplace. By the time dawn had begun to creep across the Surrey landscape, painting the garden's unfortunate rockeries in shades of pale gold, Whimsy had assembled in his mind the broad outlines of a narrative which accounted for the presence of the apparatus, the timing of Mr. Mallory's death, the locked study door, and most particularly the curious incident of the carpet which had been cleaned with such meticulous care following the removal of what must have been a considerable quantity of blood from the Turkish rug upon which the body had been discovered. Breakfast at the Mallory residence on Monday morning proceeded with that particular awkwardness which characterizes meals undertaken in the presence of unspoken and unusual attention to the properties of the marmalade on the part of individuals who ordinarily would have consumed their morning meal with the automaticity of long habit. Whimsy had presented himself in the dining room at the conventional hour, dressed with his customary fastidiousness in a suit of dove grey, which suggested a man of leisure rather than one engaged in the systematic unravelling of domestic homicide, and had made pleasant observations regarding the quality of the coffee and the agreeable properties of the morning light, remarks which appeared to generate in his interlocutors a sensation of mounting anxiety, not unlike that produced by the approach of an executioner who insisted upon discussing the weather. Inspector Craigie, having been summoned by telephone at an early hour, and having arrived at the Mallory residence in a state of barely suppressed curiosity, had stationed himself in the breakfast room with the air of a man preparing for developments which his experience suggested would prove considerably more interesting than his initial assessment of the case had indicated. It was only when the household members had largely completed their morning ablutions and had assembled themselves in the drawing-room, the customary venue for Whimsy's pronouncements, which had acquired through repetition the quality of a theatrical stage awaiting the delivery of a dramatic revelation, that Whimsy had begun his exposition with a comment regarding the remarkable properties of certain chemical compounds when subjected to controlled heating, a subject which appeared to possess no relevance to the assembled company until he had expanded upon it with sufficient specificity to render the connection unavoidable. He had explained, with the patient clarity of one addressing an audience of moderate intellectual capacity, that certain substances, when heated to precise temperatures, produced vapors of considerable toxicity. Vapors which, when inhaled in sufficient quantity, would produce not immediate death, but rather a cascade of physiological responses, commencing with respiratory distress, progressing through loss of consciousness, and culminating in cerebral hemorrhage of a nature which could superficially resemble the consequences of a fall resulting in impact trauma to the cranium. The presence of the carpet cleaning, he had observed, suggested that whoever had engineered this particular method of murder had anticipated the production of blood and had undertaken preliminary measures to obscure evidence of hemorrhage, though the incompleteness of the cleaning effort indicated either haste or an imperfect understanding of the quantity of blood which such an injury would produce. Young Mr. Marchmont had at this juncture made the tactical error of inquiring, with a voice that suggested his nervous system was operating at considerably elevated stress levels, what possible motive might exist for anyone within the household to undertake such an elaborate scheme. A question which, appeared to strike him even as he spoke as containing implications which he would have preferred to leave unexamined. Whimsy had responded to this query by producing the letters he had discovered in Mr. Mallory's desk, documents which he had carefully examined, and which he now distributed to Inspector Craigie with the air of one presenting evidence of considerable significance, remarking as he did so that the handwriting appeared consistent with that employed by Miss Thorne in her various household accounts and correspondence, and that the content suggested a relationship of considerable intimacy between Mr. Mallory and the housekeeper extending back some 15 years to a period which coincided precisely with her employment in the household. The letters themselves, he had continued with the precision of one delivering a particularly intricate logical argument, made repeated reference to a financial arrangement whereby Miss Thorne had been provided with a modest annual stipend in exchange for what the correspondence delicately termed companionship and discretion, an arrangement which appeared to have been satisfactory to both parties until such time as Mr. Mallory, in the manner of aging men who have formed what they believe to be lasting attachments, had begun to consider the possibility of his approaching mortality and the disposition of his considerable estate. It was here that Whimsy had paused and had directed attention to a will, produced from his pocket with the air of one who had undertaken certain preliminary investigations into the probate documents held by Mr. Mallory's solicitors, which indicated that the deceased had recently altered his testamentary arrangements to provide Miss Thorne with a bequest of £5,000, a substantial sum certainly, but one which fell considerably short of the amount which she had apparently come to expect would be forthcoming upon his death. Furthermore, he had observed, there existed evidence in the form of correspondence with Mr. Mallory's banker, indicating that the elderly gentleman had begun to develop certain doubts regarding the propriety of the financial arrangement, doubts which had apparently crystallized into a decision to terminate the payments in question upon the occasion of his 65th birthday, which would have occurred some 3 months hence. Miss Thorne's expression, throughout this recitation, had undergone a progressive transformation from defensive hostility, through various stages of resignation, to a final state of something approaching emotional collapse. The housekeeper sinking into the nearest chair with a visible diminishment of the rigid posture which had previously characterized her bearing. It was only when Whimsy had produced the final piece of evidence, a purchase order from a chemical supply firm in London dated some 2 weeks previous and bearing a signature which proved upon examination to be a careful forgery of Mr. Mallory's own hand, that the assembled company had begun to comprehend the full extent of the premeditation which had characterized the crime, and the grim calculation with which Miss Thorne had decided that her 15 years of devotion entitled her to more substantial compensation than Mr. Mallory had ultimately determined to provide. The silence which followed Whimsy's final revelation was of that particular quality which suggests an audience confronted with truths which they have simultaneously anticipated and dreaded. A suspended moment during which the various inhabitants of the drawing-room appeared to be processing the implications of what had been presented to them with the comprehension of individuals watching a familiar landscape transform before their eyes into something at once recognizable and profoundly alien. Mrs. Dorothy Mallory, having maintained throughout the proceedings an expression of carefully cultivated incomprehension, had begun to manifest signs of genuine distress at the realization that her brother-in-law's romantic entanglement had been not merely a matter of idle gossip, but rather the catalyst for his demise, while young Mr. Marchmont had undergone a transformation of considerable magnitude, the calculating anxiety which had previously characterized his features being replaced by something approaching genuine shock at the discovery that his anticipated inheritance had been placed in jeopardy not by profligacy on his uncle's part, but by murder of the most calculated variety. It was Inspector Craigie, however, who had first recovered sufficient equilibrium to address the matter at hand, his professional instincts reasserting themselves as he had begun to formulate the specific questions which the assembled evidence had rendered necessary and the procedural requirements which the law demanded be satisfied before an arrest might be undertaken with full confidence in its validity. Whimsy, sensing that the moment had arrived for the completion of his narrative, had continued with the methodical precision of one assembling the final components of a particularly intricate mechanism, explaining that the timeline of events became perfectly comprehensible once one understood that. Mr. Mallory had not died at approximately 9:15 as the household had initially believed, but rather at a considerably later hour on Friday evening, the approximation of 9:15 having been achieved through the simple expedient of advancing the study clock by some 40 minutes prior to. Locking the study door and securing the windows from the interior, the mechanism had been elegant in its simplicity, Whimsy had observed, employing a wire frame suspended within the fireplace and supporting a glass vessel containing a substance, most probably a preparation of phosphorus or some similar compound, which when heated gradually would produce vapors of lethal potency, vapors which would accumulate within the sealed study and which would ultimately produce in the individual exposed to their effects a sequence of symptoms consistent with severe intracranial trauma when the individual collapsed and struck his cranium upon the marble mantelpiece in the throes of respiratory distress and diminishing consciousness. The Friday evening timing was critical, he had explained, as it provided Miss Thorne with an opportunity to prepare the apparatus when the household was occupied with dinner in the dining room, and when Mr. Mallory, who maintained the habit of retiring to his study for an evening cigar and correspondence, would be unlikely to be disturbed by the servants. She had possessed access to all the necessary implements, the glass vessel from the pantry supplies, the wire frame which could have been fabricated from materials readily available within the household, and the chemical compound itself, procured through the forged purchase order and stored with meticulous care within the confines of her room. The killing of the clock represented the most psychologically revealing element of the crime, Whimsy had suggested, as it indicated not merely a desire to establish an alibi, but a desperate attempt to create temporal ambiguity that would obscure the true sequence of events and render impossible any precise determination of the hour of death. Saturday morning, when the body had been discovered by Prothero, the apparatus had already been destroyed, the glass vessel having been shattered in the fireplace and its fragments scattered among the ashes, while the wire frame had been dismantled and removed, leaving only the scorch marks which had ultimately provided the crucial evidence of its presence. The carpet cleaning represented Miss Thorne's response to the quantity of blood produced by the cerebral hemorrhage. Though her attempt at restoration had been hasty and incomplete, the pale patch which remained serving as a beacon for any investigator sufficiently observant to recognize its significance. It was at this juncture that Miss Thorne herself had spoken for the first time since the commencement of Whimsy's exposition, her voice emerging as something barely above a whisper and carrying with it the quality of a confession offered not under duress, but rather as a relief from the burden of maintained deception. She had acknowledged, without equivocation or attempt at further denial, that she had indeed prepared the apparatus on Friday evening, had indeed advanced the clock to provide false temporal evidence, and had indeed attempted to obscure the consequences of Mr. Mallory's death through the cleaning of the carpet. Her justification for these actions had been delivered with a peculiar mixture of defiance and desperation, a recitation of the years spent in service to a man who had promised her security only to withdraw that promise at the moment when her age and circumstances rendered her most vulnerable to destitution. She had spoken of the humiliation of her position, the constant awareness that she occupied a social status neither fully servant nor fully companion, and the devastating realization that the man upon whose largesse she had come to depend had begun to view her as an inconvenient encumbrance to be pensioned off at a rate considerably below her expectations. What she had not articulated, though it hung unspoken in the atmosphere of the drawing room, was the terrible logic which had led her from despair to calculation, from calculation to preparation, and from preparation to the act itself, a progression so gradual as to be almost imperceptible. Yet so. Inevitable in its momentum that once embarked upon, resistance seemed impossible, and reversal unthinkable. The formal arrest of Miss Thorne proceeded with that peculiar combination of procedural efficiency and human awkwardness which characterizes such moments in English country houses. The police constables who had been summoned to effect the apprehension moving through the drawing-room with expressions suggesting they were engaged in a task of considerable delicacy, as though the removal of a woman of Miss Thorne's age and apparent respectability from her position of trust represented a violation of some fundamental social compact which transcended the mere commission of homicide. Whimsy had observed the proceedings with the detached courtesy which he invariably maintained during such transitional moments, offering cigarettes to those members of the household who appeared in need of immediate sedation, and remarking with appropriate gravity upon the tragic nature of circumstances which had transformed a woman of previously exemplary service into an instrument of vengeance and self-preservation. It was only after Miss Thorne had been conveyed from the house, and the drawing-room had settled into that particular silence which follows the removal of a central figure from a domestic tableau, that Whimsy had turned his attention to addressing the remaining questions which logic suggested, required resolution, and which he had begun to articulate with the precision of one who had, through the course of his investigation, become aware of certain secondary mysteries which the establishment of Miss Thorne's guilt had rendered rather more pressing in their implications. The matter of the spoon, for instance, had continued to exercise his intellectual faculties in a manner which suggested that young Mr. Marchmont's mislabeling of that object had represented something considerably more substantial than mere ignorance or carelessness, a consideration which had prompted him to request a private conversation with the nephew, conducted in the study amid the lingering olfactory remnants of chemical compounds and approaching decomposition. It was during this conversation that Mr. Marchmont had become possessed of what Whimsy had characterized as an acute attack of nervous transparency, his carefully maintained facade of detached concern crumbling away to reveal a young man of considerably less moral fortitude than his social position would have suggested, and whose principal involvement in the circumstances surrounding his uncle's death had consisted not of active participation in the murder, but rather in the considerably less defensible crime of attempted exploitation of the situation for personal financial advantage. Specifically, Whimsy had discovered through a series of inquiries directed toward examining the household silver and the various items of value which constituted Mr. Mallory's modest collection of material goods that young Mr. Marchmont had undertaken a systematic inventory of these objects with the transparent intention of determining which items might be sold or pawned without occasioning immediate notice, an undertaking which had been facilitated by his familiarity with the household and his understanding of his uncle's often casual approach to the documentation of his possessions. The spoon in question had represented merely one element of this broader scheme, though it had possessed particular significance insofar as it had prompted Mr. Marchmont to research the provenance and value of various items in the collection, research which had ultimately led him to the discovery that certain pieces which he had assumed to be of modest worth were in fact of considerably greater value, and which had therefore rendered them considerably more attractive targets for his acquisitive attentions. Whimsy had conveyed to the young man, with that particular mixture of contempt and mild amusement which characterized his approach to individuals of limited moral imagination, that while his activities represented a form of theft which technically warranted legal prosecution, he had determined that the matter might be resolved through the intervention of his uncle's solicitors, and a formal restitution of the items which had been removed from the household provided that Miss Marchmont could be persuaded to accept this resolution without further recourse to prevarication or attempted subterfuge. The relief which had manifested itself upon young Mr. Marchmont's features at this pronouncement had been sufficiently transparent to suggest that he had been prepared for considerably worse treatment, and he had indicated his willingness to comply with Whimsy's conditions with an alacrity which suggested genuine gratitude at being permitted to extricate himself from circumstances which had threatened to become considerably more complicated. Whimsy had then returned to the drawing-room, where Inspector Craigie had been conducting a final inventory of the evidence which would be necessary for the eventual prosecution of Miss Thorne, and had remarked with the casual tone of one making an observation of minor significance that the matter appeared now to be substantially resolved, with the exception of certain details regarding the precise composition of the chemical compound which had been employed in the commission of the murder, a matter which he had suggested might be clarified through laboratory analysis of the residual substances discovered in the fireplace and the fragments of glass recovered from that location. Inspector Craigie had accepted this assessment with the satisfaction of a man whose professional instincts had been vindicated, and who could now proceed with the comforting certainty that the perpetrator of the crime had been identified, apprehended, and would shortly face the full machinery of English justice, a prospect which appeared to afford him considerable satisfaction, despite the tragic circumstances which had necessitated his intervention in what had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of accidental death. It was only as the afternoon began its inevitable descent toward evening, and as the autumn light acquired that peculiar quality of melancholy which seems to affect English country landscapes with the regularity of seasonal change, that Whimsy had excused himself from the household with the suggestion that his presence might no longer be required, and that the various members of the Mallory family would doubtless benefit from a period of relative solitude in which to process the extraordinary revelations which the preceding days had generated, and to contemplate the manner in which the comfortable routines of domestic life could be so catastrophically disrupted by the eruption of human passion and desperation into the orderly realm of suburban Surrey. The railway journey which conveyed Whimsy from Surrey back to London proceeded with that characteristically British combination of punctuality and discomfort which distinguishes the commuter express from more leisurely forms of rail travel, and it was during the course of this transit that he had found himself seated opposite a gentleman of middle years whose appearance suggested a professional man of some standing, and whose perusal of the morning edition of the Times indicated an individual possessed of at least nominal concern for matters of current importance. It was this gentleman who had initially broached the subject of the Mallory murder, having observed in the newspaper certain preliminary reports regarding the arrest of a housekeeper in connection with the death of a retired tea merchant in Surrey, and having made what he had assumed to be an informed observation regarding the apparent simplicity of the crime and the somewhat pedestrian nature of the motive. Whimsy had regarded this individual with the expression of one encountering a particularly instructive example of the human tendency towards superficial judgment, and had gently suggested that the gentleman's assessment of both the simplicity and the motivation appeared to suffer from certain deficiencies in observational acuity and psychological comprehension which a more thorough examination of the available facts might have rectified. The conversation which had ensued had proceeded in that manner characteristic of Whimsy's interactions with strangers, a series of apparently casual inquiries which had gradually drawn forth from his interlocutor a more complete understanding of the complexity which underlay what had initially appeared to be a straightforward domestic crime, and which had left the gentleman with the uncomfortable conviction that his own analytical faculties were considerably less reliable than he had previously assumed. It was only upon his arrival at his Piccadilly flat, however, that Whimsy had permitted himself to give full consideration to those aspects of the Mallory affair which had continued to exercise his intellectual faculties throughout the preceding investigation, and which had suggested to him that Miss Thorne's confession, while substantially accurate in its material particulars, had nonetheless omitted certain psychological nuances which he believed worthy of further contemplation. He had settled himself into the comfortable chair which constituted his preferred venue for post-investigation reflection, and had instructed Bunter, his valet and perpetual companion in matters both domestic and criminal, to prepare a restorative beverage while he assembled his thoughts regarding the fundamental question which the case had raised, and which he perceived to be of considerably greater significance than the mere determination of culpability or the identification of methodology. That question concerned itself with the precise psychological moment at which Miss Thorne had transformed from a woman of disappointing circumstances into an instrument of fatal calculation, and the manner in which desperation had metastasized into homicidal determination through the accumulation of small humiliations and economic anxieties which might individually have been survivable but which collectively had produced a psychological state susceptible to the commission of acts which her younger self would unquestionably have repudiated. He had reflected, with that capacity for empathy which distinguished his approach to criminal psychology from that of more prosaic investigators, upon the terrible mathematics of Miss Thorne's situation, the manner in which her years of faithful service had accumulated not toward security but toward dependency, and the devastating realization that the man upon whom she had permitted herself to rely represented not a permanent fixture in her existence, but rather a temporary arrangement subject to termination at his whim. The letters which he had discovered in Mr. Mallory's desk had provided him with considerable insight into the emotional trajectory of their relationship, revealing in their progression from passionate declaration through routine affection to increasingly perfunctory acknowledgement the gradual erosion of genuine connection which had coincided precisely with Mr. Mallory's advancement in years and the attendant development of those physical and emotional limitations which age imposes upon even the most well-intentioned individuals. What had emerged from this progression was not a picture of wanton cruelty on Mr. Mallory's part, but rather a portrait of a man of limited imagination confronting the approaching reality of his own mortality and attempting to manage his affairs with a logic which ignored the human costs of his decisions, a blindness which had ultimately rendered him vulnerable to the actions of an individual whose desperation had transcended the customary constraints of morality and prudence. Whimsy had recognized, moreover, that the elaborate nature of Miss Thorne's crime, the careful preparation of the apparatus, the meticulous timing, the falsification of the clock, the cleaning of the carpet, had represented not merely the practical requirements of concealing a murder, but rather a form of psychological theater through which she had sought to assert control over circumstances which had otherwise rendered her utterly powerless. The planning of the crime had provided her with an illusion of agency, a sense that she was not merely a victim of economic circumstance, but rather an active participant in determining her own fate, however catastrophically that determination might ultimately manifest itself. It was this psychological dimension of the crime which had remained largely unexplored in the interviews and confessions which had characterized the investigation's official conclusion, and which Whimsy had determined warranted preservation in the private record which he maintained of his more significant cases. He had consequently composed, during the evening which followed his return to London, a lengthy memorandum addressing himself to the psychological rather than the procedural aspects of the Mallory murder, a document which he had filed away with the knowledge that it would remain accessible to his own future reflection, even if the official machinery of criminal justice would find little use for such psychological abstractions in the determination of guilt and the imposition of punishment. The matter might have remained in the realm of Whimsy's private contemplation indefinitely, had not the emergence of an unexpected complication during the preliminary examination of Miss Thorne's case necessitated his return to the legal proceedings which had followed her arrest. A development which had manifested itself in the form of a letter from Inspector Craigie requesting his presence at Scotland Yard to address certain discrepancies which had emerged during the taking of Miss Thorne's formal statement to the magistrate. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, some 7 days subsequent to his departure from the Mallory residence, that Whimsy had presented himself at the familiar corridors of the police headquarters, where he had discovered Inspector Craigie in a state of considerable agitation. The normally composed officer, presenting evidence of having undergone a sleepless night and demonstrated the facial characteristics of an individual confronting a problem which the application of routine procedure had proven inadequate to resolve. The difficulty, it transpired, concerned itself with certain inconsistencies in Miss Thorne's account of the precise timing and execution of her crime. Inconsistencies which had emerged not from the investigation, but rather from Miss Thorne herself, who had begun to manifest what Craigie had characterized as an unusual resistance to the acceptance of the guilt which she had previously confessed with such apparent completeness. Specifically, Miss Thorne had called into question certain details of Whimsy's reconstruction, most particularly the manner in which the apparatus had been positioned within the fireplace and the precise quantity of the chemical compound which would have been required to produce the fatal vapors. Details which she had claimed, with increasing vehemence, could not have been accomplished in the manner which Whimsy had suggested, and which had led her to question whether she had indeed perpetrated the crime in the manner to which she had confessed, or whether she had been systematically led toward a confession through the subtle manipulation of evidence and inference. This development had struck Whimsy with the force of something entirely unexpected, a reversal of the psychological trajectory which the investigation had appeared to have established, and which had suggested that Miss Thorne's confession might represent not a genuine acknowledgment of culpability, but rather a capitulation to circumstantial pressure and her own exhaustion, a distinction of considerable legal and moral significance. He had consequently requested a private interview with Miss Thorne, conducted in the austere confines of the police station's interview room, a space which appeared designed specifically for the discouragement of human comfort and the promotion of psychological vulnerability. It was during this conversation that the extraordinary reversal which Inspector Craigie had alluded to had become unmistakably apparent. Miss Thorne's demeanor having undergone a transformation from the resigned acceptance which had characterized her previous statements to a state of something approaching desperate assertion, her voice acquiring a quality of emotional intensity which suggested that she had come to perceive the confession which she had made as a betrayal not merely of her own interests, but of some fundamental truth which she believed herself obligated to defend. She had insisted, with a clarity and conviction which stood in marked contrast to her earlier faltering responses, that while she had indeed prepared the apparatus and had indeed harbored genuine resentment toward Mr. Mallory for his treatment of her, she had not in fact proceeded to deploy the apparatus with the intention of producing Mr. Mallory's death, and that the murder itself must have been accomplished through some alternative mechanism which the investigation had failed to identify or examine with appropriate thoroughness. The specificity of her objections had required Whimsy to undertake a fundamental reconsideration of his own reconstruction, a process which had involved returning to the Mallory residence and subjecting the study to an examination of considerably greater minuteness than his previous investigation had necessitated, an undertaking which had occupied him throughout the latter portion of the afternoon and into the early evening hours. It was during this secondary examination that certain details which had previously appeared peripheral to the investigation had begun to acquire a significance which had been invisible during his initial assessment, most particularly the arrangement of the study furniture and the precise, Positioning of the chairs relative to both the mantelpiece and the window, a configuration which suggested that an individual standing at the desk would have possessed a view of the fireplace only through an angle of reflection from the study's central mirror. Furthermore, upon examining the mirror itself with considerably greater attention than he had previously devoted to it, Whimsy had discovered certain minute scratches upon its silvered surface, scratches which suggested the recent removal and replacement of some object which had previously been mounted upon or reflected by its surface, a detail which had led him to inquire, with a precision of purpose which suggested the emergence of a previously unsuspected avenue of investigation, into the history and provenance of the mirror and the manner in which it had been positioned relative to the remainder of the study's furnishings. It was at this juncture that young Mr. Marchmont had proven invaluable, his guilty conscience regarding his own attempted depredations having rendered him considerably more cooperative than he might otherwise have been, and his recollection of having observed his uncle engaged in adjusting the mirror's position some 2 weeks prior to his death, providing Whimsy with a crucial temporal marker. The young man had recalled, moreover, that his uncle had appeared to be engaged in some form of optical experiment, positioning various objects at specific distances from the mirror and observing their reflection with a concentration which suggested to Marchmont at the time that his uncle had perhaps developed an interest in some form of scientific hobby or mechanical investigation, a recollection which had illuminated with sudden clarity the true nature of the apparatus which had been suspended within the fireplace, and the manner in which it might have been employed to create an effect of considerably greater subtlety and complexity than the simple production of toxic vapors would have suggested. The terrible clarity which had suddenly descended upon Whimsy's understanding of the crime's true mechanism had produced in him a state of emotional disturbance which he had found it necessary to conceal beneath a facade of studied detachment, a professional mask which he had maintained throughout his subsequent interviews, but which had crumbled entirely in the privacy of his Piccadilly flat, where Bunter had observed his employer's evident distress with that particular mixture of concern and discretion which characterized the valet's approach to matters of psychological vulnerability. The truth which Whimsy had been forced to confront was considerably more sinister and infinitely more complex than the straightforward narrative of chemical poisoning which the investigation had appeared to establish. A truth which involved not Miss Thorne's guilt, but rather her systematic manipulation by an individual whose intelligence and psychological sophistication had rendered him capable of orchestrating a crime of such elaborate psychological design that its very complexity had served to obscure his culpability. That individual was, with a certainty which transcended mere hypothesis or deductive inference, young Mr. Marchmont himself, whose apparent financial incompetence and moral weakness had concealed an intellect of considerable acuity, and a capacity for deliberate cruelty which the surface examination of his character would never have suggested. The apparatus which had been suspended within the fireplace had not been designed to produce lethal vapors at all, but rather had served a considerably more refined purpose, functioning as a component of an optical device which, when combined with the mirror which Mr. Mallory had been observed adjusting prior to his death, would have produced a reflection of such complexity and apparent impossibility that an individual of Mr. Mallory's psychological constitution would have been driven to investigate the phenomenon with mounting alarm and desperation. The chemical compound had not been intended to kill, but rather to produce smoke or vapor sufficient to render visible the precise angles of light reflection which would have created the illusion, a staging of such psychological sophistication that it would have appeared to the observer to constitute either an invasion of his study by some external agency, or more likely, given his age and nervous constitution, evidence of the onset of mental derangement. Whimsy had recognized, with a clarity which had left him feeling somewhat soiled by the comprehension, that Marchmont had engineered the entire situation with the calculated intent of convincing his uncle that he was experiencing the early manifestations of serious mental illness, a conviction which would have been reinforced by the nephew's carefully orchestrated expressions of concern and his subtle suggestions that medical consultation might be warranted. The financial motive which the investigation had identified as driving Miss Thorne's presumed guilt had in fact applied with considerably greater force to Marchmont himself, whose debts and financial embarrassments had rendered him desperate for access to the considerable estate which his uncle's death would release to him as the sole surviving male heir, provided only that he could establish his uncle's mental incompetence sufficiently to alter the testamentary arrangements or to place himself in a position of control over the estate's disposition. The apparatus had been prepared and deployed with the specific intention of inducing a state of psychological crisis, a crisis which would have ultimately led either to Mr. Mallory's voluntary consultation with medical specialists who might have been persuaded to declare him mentally unfit, or to a suicide which would have appeared to result from the terror inspired by apparent supernatural manifestation or incipient madness. The actual death, which had occurred when Mr. Mallory had struck his head upon the mantelpiece in the throes of panic and psychological distress, had been precisely what Marchmont had engineered, though the manner of its accomplishment had involved not chemical poisoning, but rather psychological assault of such diabolical sophistication that it had taken the combined investigative efforts of both Whimsy and the official police apparatus to render it visible. Miss Thorne's guilt in preparing the apparatus and her confession to the crime had resulted from her conviction that she had indeed, through her preparation of the device, been responsible for her employer's death, an assumption which Marchmont had deliberately cultivated by placing the materials within her access and by ensuring that his own superficially innocent remarks had drawn her attention to the apparatus he had constructed. She had become, through a process of psychological manipulation as refined as that which he had applied to his uncle, a willing accomplice to her own incrimination, her guilt genuine in its emotional reality, even though her actual culpability in the murder itself was substantially less than the evidence had appeared to suggest. The implications of this revelation had struck Whimsy with the force of a physical blow. The realization that he had permitted himself to be maneuvered by Marchmont's carefully constructed deceptions into confirming a narrative which had served the interests of the actual murderer while appearing to establish the guilt of an individual who had been, in the final analysis, a pawn in a game of psychological manipulation of extraordinary complexity. He had sat in his flat, nursing a whiskey which Bunter had providently placed before him, and had contemplated the necessity of returning to the authorities with this revelation, and of articulating to Inspector Craigie a theory which would require the examination of evidence from an entirely novel perspective, and which would necessitate the dismantling of the case which had appeared so satisfactorily resolved merely hours previous. The prospect had filled him with a sense of profound weariness, not merely because of the investigative labor which lay ahead, but because of the recognition that the world contained individuals possessed of an intelligence sufficient to engineer such elaborate manipulations, and that the application of logic and reason to the detection of crime could serve the interests of precisely those individuals whose mental sophistication rendered them most dangerous to society and least likely to be apprehended through conventional means. The confrontation which Whimsy had orchestrated for the following morning proceeded with that particular quality of theatrical precision which he invariably employed when the moment had arrived for the exposure of a criminal whose sophistication demanded a response of equal intellectual caliber. A staging which he had arranged in the study of the Mallory residence, with Inspector Craigie present in an auxiliary capacity, and with young Mr. Marchmont summoned under the pretext of a final interview regarding certain matters of inheritance and estate disposition. Whimsy had positioned himself with deliberate care at the study desk, the precise location from which Mr. Mallory would have viewed the mirror's reflection, and from which the apparatus suspended within the fireplace would have created its illusory effects. And he had begun his exposition with a tone of casual observation which belied the considerable weight of the accusation he was preparing to deliver. He had remarked, with the air of one engaged in idle speculation, upon the remarkable properties of human perception, and the manner in which the mind constructs reality from sensory data which is often substantially incomplete or actively misleading. A philosophical preamble which young Mr. Marchmont had received with visible discomfort, his customary expression of languid superiority giving way to something approximating nervous tension. Whimsy had then proceeded, with meticulous precision, to reconstruct the apparatus not as a device for producing poisonous vapors, but rather as a component of an optical illusion of extraordinary subtlety, explaining in detail the manner in which light might be refracted and reflected to create the appearance of impossible phenomena, and the psychological impact which such phenomena would exercise upon an individual predisposed toward anxiety and possessed of declining health. The nephew's face had undergone a progressive transformation, as the implications of Whimsy's analysis had become inescapable, the careful facade of innocent bewilderment crumbling away to reveal something considerably more sinister beneath, a glimpse of the calculating intellect which had engineered the entire elaborate scheme with such meticulous attention to psychological detail. It was at the moment when Whimsy had produced the revised chemical analysis demonstrating that the compound discovered in the fireplace was not in fact lethal but rather a substance chosen specifically for its capacity to produce visible smoke when heated to particular temperatures, that young Mr. Marchmont had made the tactical error which had confirmed the entire hypothesis, his hand moving instinctively toward the mantelpiece as though he might physically arrest the proceeding, a gesture which had revealed not merely guilt but the psychological pressure which the exposure of his crime had generated within his consciousness. Whimsy had then completed his analysis by addressing the question which had troubled him throughout the investigation, the precise manner in which Marchmont had manipulated Miss Thorne into preparation of the apparatus, while maintaining sufficient psychological distance to preserve his own deniability, explaining that the nephew had accomplished this through a series of apparently casual remarks regarding his uncle's mental state, coupled with strategic placement of chemical materials within the housekeeper's area of responsibility and subtle suggestions that her employer's apparent instability might warrant her concern and intervention. The brilliance of the scheme, Whimsy had observed with a tone suggesting reluctant admiration, had consisted in the recognition that Miss Thorne's own guilt regarding her relationship with Mr. Mallory would render her susceptible to psychological manipulation, and that her desire to protect her employer would overcome her natural resistance to participating in what she would gradually come to perceive as a psychiatric intervention of potentially beneficial nature. Young Mr. Marchmont had collapsed rather than surrendered, his body folding upon itself in a manner suggesting that the emotional pressure of exposure had exceeded his psychological capacity to withstand. And it was only after Inspector Craigie had called for additional officers and had undertaken the formal procedures of arrest that Whimsy had permitted himself to relax his posture and to acknowledge the profound emotional toll which the investigation had extracted from him. He had departed from the Mallory residence within the hour, declining all expressions of gratitude from the assembled household members and refusing Mrs. Dorothy Mallory's somewhat desperate offers of hospitality, remarking only that he found the atmosphere of the house had acquired certain qualities which made extended residence inadvisable, and that he believed the matter to be now substantially resolved. The return journey to London had been undertaken in solitude, Whimsy occupying a first-class compartment and engaging in no conversation beyond the essential courtesies demanded by social convention, his thoughts remaining fixed upon the terrible recognition that young Mr. Marchmont's intelligence and sophistication had not served to elevate him above the commission of murder, but rather had rendered him capable of a crime of such psychological refinement that it transcended the crude violence which characterized the vast majority of homicides. Upon his arrival at Piccadilly, Wimsey had immediately composed a detailed account of the investigation, which he had forwarded to Inspector Craigie, with a note suggesting that the psychological dimensions of the crime might warrant consultation with certain specialists in the study of criminal behavior. Though he had harbored few illusions regarding the likelihood of such consultation occurring within the framework of standard police procedure, he had then settled himself into his customary chair and had instructed Bunter to bring him a bottle of a particularly fine vintage port, remarking with weary irony that the detection of crime appeared increasingly to him to be an activity undertaken primarily for the purpose of confirming humanity's capacity for elaborate evil, and that he derived from this confirmation neither satisfaction nor any sense of moral vindication. The case would proceed through the machinery of English justice with its customary deliberation, resulting ultimately in the conviction of young Mr. Marchmont for murder and the release of Miss Thorne, though the psychological damage which she had sustained through her involvement in the crime would, Wimsey suspected, prove substantially more enduring than any legal remedy might ameliorate.